In the kingdom of Rinmere, nestled between rolling hills and ironclad forests, stood the fortress of Highstone. Its lord, Sir Aldric of Highstone, was a man of enviable fortune. His coffers overflowed with gold, his granaries never knew emptiness, and his name carried weight in every noble hall. When he walked the great hall of his castle, even seasoned knights bowed low. He was both feared and respected, a man who had climbed to his station not merely through birthright, but through cunning and valor in the king's wars. Sir Aldric had it all. Fertile lands that stretched beyond the eye, loyal men-at-arms at his command, and a family beloved by his people. His wife, Lady Alira, was known for her grace and wisdom, and his 2 sons were already being groomed for knighthood. Peasants in his lands often spoke of Aldric's fairness. He demanded taxes, yes, but he protected them from raiders and saw that no child starved in winter. Yet, as Aldric sat one evening by the long table of Highstone's hall, a heavy sense stirred in his heart. The torches burned low, the musicians played softly, and his sons wrestled on the rush-covered floor. Still, his eyes drifted toward the dark windows. Rumors had spread across the realm, of war brewing to the east, of crops failing in the south, and of a pestilence carried by merchants from distant lands. He told himself such troubles would never reach Highstone. His walls were thick, his vaults deep, and his men loyal. Yet, in that moment of stillness, he could not shake the feeling that the golden age of his life stood on the brink of something darker. The feast carried on, laughter echoing through the hall. But Aldric's mind lingered on the silence between the sounds, a silence that seemed to whisper of change. And as the night deepened, a rider galloped into the courtyard, cloak torn by the wind, his face pale as death. He demanded an audience with Lord Aldric, bearing tidings that would unravel everything the Lord of Highstone believed secure. Part 2: The First Omen. The rider's words came out in a breathless rush, each one striking like a hammer on stone. My lord war. The king's enemies march from the east. Villages burn. Entire towns are laid to ashes before the banners of Lord Cale's forces. They take gold, grain, and cattle and leave death in their wake. Aldric's hand tightened around the rim of his goblet. His sons froze mid-wrestle, and Lady Alira's face drained of color. The hall, once alive with music and laughter, now felt like a grave. Have they reached Rinmere? Aldric demanded. The rider shook his head. Not yet, but they will. And worse, his voice faltered. Some say the rivers carry sickness, my lord. Merchants fleeing the east bring it with them. Fever, plague. Those who survive often do not speak of it. A shiver ran down Aldric's spine. He had seen soldiers return from distant campaigns, pale and ragged, whispering of strange fevers that felled men in a single night. The thought of his family, of his lands, touched by both war and pestilence, gnawed at him like a rat at dry wood. That night, sleep evaded him. He walked the ramparts of Highstone, eyes scanning the horizon where the moonlight fell upon distant hills. Smoke rose far to the east, a thin, ominous veil. Somewhere beyond the forests, war marched steadily, consuming all in its path. Days passed, and Aldric's fears began to materialize. Small villages on his borders were pillaged. Merchants fled, leaving empty roads and silence. He sent men to gather his grain and gold, yet each day they returned with worse news. Hidden caches looted, storehouses burned. Even his loyal tenants whispered of hunger and fear, their faith in his protection wavering. Aldric's heart, once light with pride and wealth, began to carry the weight of dread. He realized that no walls, no soldiers, no treasure could guarantee safety. The first cracks of ruin had appeared, subtle yet unstoppable, and he felt them spread through the foundation of his life. One morning, a peasant came to the gates, coughing violently, face pale and trembling. Lord Aldric, the sickness, it has come to the lands, the children. His words faltered into a strangled gasp. Aldric gripped the battlements and looked east, where the rising smoke now mingled with mist. He had fought battles, earned lands, and amassed wealth. Yet he understood with chilling clarity that this enemy, war and plague alike, was unlike any sword he could wield. And as the sun set behind the hills, he knew the life he had built, the golden world of Highstone, was beginning to crumble. Winter arrived harshly that year, earlier than any living soul could remember. The wind tore through the stone walls of Highstone, and the once fertile fields beyond the castle were now choked with frost. Grain that had been stored for emergencies grew damp, and livestock weakened under the relentless cold. Aldric's men worked tirelessly, yet the land itself seemed to betray him. Then came the first strike that could not be met with swords or shields. A sickness, dark and invisible, spread through the nearby villages like wildfire. Peasants who had once bowed gratefully to Aldric now lay on their doorsteps, coughing, fevered, or worse, silent forever. Even his own servants fell ill, and Lady Alira, pale and trembling, refused to leave the hearth for fear of contagion. Aldric spent nights pacing the hallways, tossing gold coins from one hand to the other. They had been his talisman, his symbol of power, yet now they felt useless. No amount of silver could heal the sick. No chest of gold could fill an empty stomach or stop the rot creeping into his lands. One evening, a scout returned, riding a weary horse. "My lord, the raiders are here. They strike while the villages are weakened. Grain stores burned, cattle taken, families slaughtered." Aldric's hands shook as he gripped the scout's shoulders. "How many?" "Too many to count," the man whispered. "Your lands, they will fall if you do not act." Aldric knew he had only two choices: fight and risk dying, or surrender what remained. He gathered his household and remaining guards. The castle, once a fortress of pride, now felt like a fragile shell. He rode out to meet the raiders, sword in hand, but the men he had trained for battle were few, and many lay dead from sickness. The first clash was brutal. Men screamed and fell, and Aldric realized that even courage could not overcome hunger, disease, and overwhelming numbers. By nightfall, the raiders had taken what little remained of his livestock. Grain silos were smoldering, the fields trampled. Returning to Highstone, Aldric found Lady Alira in tears, and his sons clutching empty bowls. Gold still glittered in the halls, but its weight could not feed the family, could not chase away the fear, could not heal the sick. As he sank into a chair near the hearth, Aldric faced a truth he had never imagined. He was no longer the master of his lands. He was a man watching his life dissolve, powerless against the tides of famine and war. That night, the wind howled through the shattered gates, carrying whispers of worse to come. Aldric stared into the fire, the shadows dancing across his face, and he wondered, if all that he loved could be taken by forces beyond his control, what remained for him to fight for? The castle of Highstone, once alive with the clatter of feasts and the chatter of nobles, had fallen silent. Only the wind whispered through the empty corridors, carrying with it the scent of smoke, soot, and decay. Aldric's wealth, which had seemed eternal, had dwindled into a few scattered coins and what little food remained in the storerooms. With his sons too young to fight or fend for themselves, Aldric made a decision that would forever change him. He would leave the stone walls of Highstone and go to the lands he had once commanded, not as a lord but as a laborer. He donned simple clothes, left his sword behind, and took only what he could carry. The peasants looked at him with suspicion at first. The lord who had once issued orders and collected taxes now knelt in the frozen earth beside them, planting seed, chopping wood, and hauling water. Pride burned in Aldric's chest, yet hunger burned fiercer. His hands blistered, his back ached, and the cold bit through his thin cloak, but still he worked. Lady Alira tried to maintain her composure, but the children cried each night, and Aldric could hear the pain in their small voices. He had known loss in battle, but this grinding, slow deprivation was more insidious than any sword. The castle had protected them, gold had sheltered them, but here, in the open land, nothing could shield them from nature's cruelty. Days bled into weeks. The soil was harsh, the rains unkind, and the seed did not always grow. Yet Aldric discovered a strange lesson in humility. He learned the rhythms of the land, the language of the seasons, and the patience needed to coax life from it. He learned to see the value in small victories: a sprouting seed, a warm meal after a day of labor, a night without sickness. Still, there was danger beyond hunger. Raiders, sensing vulnerability, moved silently across the countryside. Aldric armed himself with an old hunting knife, relying on cunning and knowledge of the land rather than armor and soldiers. He defended his family, but he knew that each encounter could be their last. One evening, as he returned from gathering firewood, Aldric found a stranger at his meager hut. The man's clothes were ragged, his face gaunt. "Food, anything," he whispered. Aldric hesitated. He had little to spare. But something inside him, the part that had once been generous, proud of his name, stirred. He shared the last of their bread with the stranger. That night, as the family huddled together for warmth, Aldric realized that the world had shifted. His gold was gone, his lands were in ruin, and respect came only from deeds, not titles. And yet, as he looked at his children sleeping peacefully beside their mother, he understood a truth more powerful than wealth. Survival, honor, and humanity now depended on resilience and compassion, not on castles or crowns. The wind rattled the hut's frame, a stark reminder that hardships were far from over. Aldric knew the winter would be long, the raiders persistent, and the soil unyielding. Yet in the darkness he vowed silently. He would endure. He would reclaim life, step by step, with nothing but his hands, his mind, and the unbroken spirit of a father determined to protect his family. Spring arrived slowly, hesitant and gray. The snow melted, leaving the earth muddy and unwelcoming. Aldric, now a man hardened by months of toil, stood in the fields that had once yielded him riches without effort. Every furrow he turned, every seed he pressed into the soil, reminded him of what he had lost, and of what he must now earn. The villagers, who had once bowed to his command, now regarded him with wary curiosity. Some whispered that the Lord had come to his senses, humbled by fate. Others eyed him with suspicion, wondering if the prideful man who had once ruled Highstone could truly survive in the dirt and rain. Aldric ignored their murmurs. He had no time for shame. The plow, the sickle, the hoe, they demanded attention, endurance, and sweat. Hunger, the relentless teacher, was never far behind. Many nights he went to bed with an empty stomach, listening to the cries of his sons, counting the meager rations left for the next day. He had to be clever, for the soil was poor, and weeds often stole what little growth he coaxed from it. Yet even in these moments of despair, Aldric found glimpses of triumph. The first shoots of barley breaking through the frozen ground, a rabbit snared by careful trap, water drawn from a hidden spring. These small victories were the only gold he could claim now, and they tasted sweeter than the finest wine. But the world was not gentle. One morning, Aldric discovered that a band of raiders had passed through during the night. They had taken what little he had managed to harvest, leaving the soil trampled, his traps destroyed, and his small supply of grain stolen. Rage and fear surged together. For a moment, he longed for the power he once held, the armies and walls that had kept him safe. Then he looked at his sons, shivering but alive, and Lady Alira, her hands raw from tending the fire and washing their meager clothes. The rage shifted into determination. He would protect them. He would survive, no matter the cost. Days turned into weeks as Aldric learned the harsh lessons of the land. Rain or shine, he labored. He learned where the wild herbs grew, which roots were edible, which streams ran pure water, and which paths could keep him and his family hidden from wandering raiders. His muscles ached constantly, his hands were cracked and calloused, yet he felt a strange pride born not of wealth, but of survival earned through sheer effort and skill. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant hills, Aldric stood at the edge of the field, surveying the tiny patch of life he had coaxed from the stubborn earth. The fireflies began their dance around the hut, and the wind whispered through the trees. He had survived yet another day. But in the shadowed corners of his mind, a question gnawed at him. How long could he endure this relentless struggle? How much more would fate demand before it allowed even a single taste of peace? One damp morning, as Aldric labored to repair the roof of their humble hut, a distant sound carried through the forest, the clash of iron and the shouted voices of men. He froze, gripping the hammer like a lifeline. Raiders, or perhaps soldiers, wandering these lands in search of deserters and stragglers. His mind flashed to Highstone. Once, he had given orders from stone walls, commanding men who feared him and allies who honored him. Now he crouched in mud and rain, a man with no army, no walls, no golden name to protect him. The memories gnawed at him. Feasts, laughter, banners fluttering in the wind, and the unquestioned loyalty of men who had once called him Lord. Aldric's sons, unaware of the danger, played with sticks in the mud. Lady Alira washed clothes in a nearby stream, singing softly to soothe the children. He watched them, chest tightening with fear, knowing he must shield them from both hunger and violence. He moved swiftly, leading his family through hidden paths in the woods. Every snapping twig echoed like a drumbeat of doom. Every shadow seemed to harbor a predator. He remembered hunting with his father as a boy, learning the forest's secrets, yet never had those lessons seemed so vital. Survival depended not on skill with sword or coin, but on knowledge, patience, and caution. That night, they returned to the hut, hearts pounding, to find the remains of their meager stores destroyed. The raiders had come, leaving nothing behind. Aldric sank to the ground, exhaustion and despair pressing down like a leaden weight. Yet, as he looked at his family, he understood that surrender was impossible. They had no walls, no gold, no army, but they had each other, and that, he realized, was worth fighting for. The days grew darker, and rumors of disease spreading alongside the raiders reached Aldric. One of the villagers he had helped before lay dying from the sickness, and his family had been in close contact with them. Fear coiled around Aldric's heart. If plague touched them now, all of his hard-earned survival could vanish in an instant. He remembered the wealth of Highstone, and for the first time he truly mourned it. Not for the gold, not for the lands, but for the illusion of control it had given him. Power had been a fragile mask. Now, stripped bare, he understood the depth of vulnerability. That night, by the weak glow of a fire, Aldric swore a vow. No matter the hunger, the raiders, the sickness, or the bitter cold, he would endure. His family would endure. And somehow, they would carve a life from the ashes of the one he had lost. Yet as he stared into the darkness outside their hut, he could not shake the feeling that the trials had only just begun. Something deeper, more relentless than hunger or disease, was waiting on the horizon. Something that would test the very limits of his strength and spirit. The next spring came with no mercy. The soil, still recovering from the harsh winter, refused to yield easily, and the family's hunger never fully abated. Aldric rose before dawn, aching muscles and blistered hands, a constant reminder that survival demanded more than courage. It demanded sacrifice. One morning, while fetching water from a distant stream, Aldric noticed smoke curling from the horizon. His heart sank. Raiders again. Or worse, villagers driven desperate by famine, turning violent. He ran back to the hut, shouting for his family to hide, gathering what little food remained into his arms. Lady Alira ushered the children beneath the floorboards, while Aldric climbed a hill to get a clearer view. From the ridge, he saw the truth. A small band of desperate men, armed with crude weapons, moving toward them. Not soldiers, not raiders, they were hungry peasants, desperate to survive. Aldric's first instinct was to fight, but the truth weighed on him like stone. He had no sword, no armor, and even if he did, what right had he to kill men starving as he was? He descended slowly, hands raised, and greeted them with calm words. "We have little, but I will share what we can spare. Leave violence behind, and none shall go hungry." The men stared, wary, then one spoke. "You, a lord? You know how to feed your own?" Aldric swallowed his pride. "I know how to survive, and I know that survival is not won through killing each other." Over the next hours, they divided the meager food. Tensions ran high, but no one left starving. Aldric realized that this act of mercy was not just moral, it was practical. In a world stripped of law, alliances and goodwill were as vital as sword and shield. That night, as the family huddled together, Aldric felt a strange exhaustion, unlike any before. He was weary not from labor alone, but from the weight of responsibility, the endless decisions that determined life or death. The seasons, the sickness, the raiders, the famine, each demanded a toll. And yet, he knew the price was worth paying. But the night brought no peace. A howl echoed through the forest, wild and unnatural, and Aldric knew that survival would not be measured solely by the cleverness of his hands or the strength of his arms. There were forces beyond hunger and men, forces of chance, of cruelty, and of nature itself, that would continue to test him. He pressed a hand to his sons' heads, silent and resolute. No matter what came next, they would endure. Summer came, harsh and unrelenting. The sun scorched the fields, drying the soil and stunting the growth of the few crops Aldric had planted. The small garden that had given him hope now offered only parched roots and wilted leaves. Every day became a battle against thirst, heat, and the creeping despair that threatened to sap his resolve. Aldric worked from dawn until the stars emerged, tending the land, mending tools, and hunting what little game the forest still harbored. His children helped when they could, but their small hands were no match for the hard labor required to coax sustenance from the unyielding earth. Lady Alira, once accustomed to the luxuries of Highstone, now labored alongside him, her hands cracked and her body thin, yet her determination remained unbroken. One evening, as he returned from setting traps, Aldric discovered the terrible cost of the previous night's raid. A fox he had caught was gone, the snare destroyed. Rage and despair surged, but he suppressed it. Anger would not fill empty bellies. He could only work harder, endure more, and pray that luck, however thin, would grant them mercy. Despite his suffering, Aldric found lessons hidden in the struggle. He discovered edible roots he had once ignored, ways to trap rabbits silently, and how to store water from a nearby spring so it would not spoil. These small victories, though humble, rekindled a spark within him. Survival was no longer about the wealth he had lost. It was about learning to live within the world as it truly was, stripped of titles, gold, and false security. Yet even as he adapted, the shadow of fate continued to loom. Disease crept into the village, carried by travelers and stray animals. One by one, neighbors and acquaintances fell ill. The fear of sickness gripped Aldric's heart, for he could not bear to lose his family. He fortified the hut as best he could, burned herbs for smoke, and prayed silently that the pestilence would pass them by. One night, while the family huddled together under a thin blanket, Aldric heard footsteps outside. His knife in hand, he crept to the door. Standing there was a boy, no older than his eldest son, trembling and gaunt. "Please, food," he whispered. Aldric's chest tightened. He had barely enough for his own family, yet he remembered the mercy he had shown to desperate men months before. Slowly, he handed the boy a handful of dried roots and a piece of stale bread. The boy's eyes filled with tears, and he ran into the night, a fragile hope rekindled in his heart. That night, Aldric realized something he could not have understood as a lord. True wealth was not measured in gold, lands, or titles, but in survival, in mercy, and in the small victories that kept life flickering against the darkness. Still, as he stared into the fire, he knew the road ahead was far from over. The land was harsh, the raiders persistent, and sickness merciless. Each day demanded more than yesterday, and Aldric wondered if even the strongest spirit could endure what fate had yet to unleash. Autumn arrived with a chill that seeped into bones and heart alike. The leaves, once green and full of life, turned brittle and gold, falling to the earth in a quiet reminder of mortality. Aldric watched them drift, each one a symbol of what he had lost. Wealth, power, comfort, and the certainty that his family would be safe. This season brought with it a new and harsher challenge. His eldest son, now 12, fell ill. At first it was a fever, then weakness, then coughing that racked his small body. Lady Alira wept silently beside him, washing his sweat-soaked shirt, while Aldric tried desperately to find herbs and remedies in the cold forest. Every night, he sat awake, praying, hands clenched, willing the boy's strength to return. Days stretched into weeks. The boy's condition fluctuated, sometimes improving, sometimes worsening. Each time Aldric thought he might lose him, a flicker of hope returned. His child's stubbornness, a spark of life that refused to surrender. Aldric realized, with painful clarity, that survival now was not only about food or labor. It was about endurance, vigilance, and the fragile grace of fortune. Meanwhile, the land provided little. The harvest was meager. Frost had destroyed much of the late crops. He had learned to stretch every root, every grain, every morsel. Hunger was no longer occasional. It was a constant companion, gnawing at the edges of patience and temper. One evening, after a particularly long day of gathering firewood in the cold rain, Aldric returned to find the hut broken into. The raiders had come once more, taking what little remained. Fear and fury surged through him, yet he caught sight of his son's pale but resilient face and Lady Alira's steady hands, and the anger shifted into a grim determination. He would rebuild, he would protect, and he would endure. That night, as he repaired the broken door and patched the walls with his own hands, Aldric understood the cost of his former life. Gold could not defend against frost or plague. Armies could not protect against hunger. Titles could not shield from despair. Every day forward, he would learn to rely only on what he could see, touch, and shape with his own hands. As the wind moaned through the gaps in the hut, Aldric pressed a hand to his chest, feeling the steady heartbeat of his family beside him. He had lost everything, yet somehow, that loss had revealed a truth stronger than any fortress or coin. They still had each other, and that bond alone might be enough to face the dark months ahead. But outside, the shadows deepened. The forests whispered of dangers yet unseen, of hunger yet unmet, of cruelty that would test Aldric beyond the limits of endurance. And as he closed his eyes for a restless sleep, he knew that survival was only the beginning of the trials to come. Winter came early that year, harsher than any Aldric had endured. Snow blanketed the ground in thick, icy sheets, and the wind cut through clothing, wood, and bone alike. The forest, which had once offered him food and refuge, now seemed an unforgiving expanse of white and gray. Every step outside the hut was a gamble against frostbite, starvation, and the lingering threat of raiders who preyed on weakness. The meager harvest from autumn had mostly spoiled, leaving Aldric to rely on stored roots and small game he trapped in the frozen forest. Hunger had become a constant ache, gnawing not only at his stomach but at his patience, his temper, his very spirit. Nights were the worst. He would sit beside the fire, staring into the flames, counting every heartbeat of his family, fearing the moment the cold or disease would take them. One night, a storm swept over the hills. The wind howled like a wounded beast, shaking the fragile walls of their hut. Aldric clutched his sons close to him, shielding them as best he could. Rain and snow mixed, soaking the roof and dripping into their bedrolls. Lady Alira worked feverishly to patch holes, to keep embers alive, to preserve whatever warmth remained. It was then that he realized the cruel truth of this new existence. The world no longer bent to the will of men. Nature, famine, disease, and human cruelty all moved with indifferent force, and there were no walls, no gold, no soldiers that could protect those he loved. The survival of his family depended solely on him, and on luck, the smallest mercy in a world that offered so little. Despite the relentless cold and hunger, Aldric found moments of clarity. He learned to read the skies, to track the movement of animals under snow, and to preserve food against spoilage. He discovered ways to make simple traps from twigs and string, ways to purify water using heat and stones, and ways to stretch a meager portion of bread into a full meal for 4. Each day was a battle, and each small victory felt monumental. Yet danger was never far. One evening, footsteps crunched in the snow outside. Aldric grabbed his knife, ready to defend his family, heart hammering. Peering through the frosted window, he saw a lone figure. A man, ragged, frostbitten, carrying nothing but a bundle. He paused, trembling, and whispered hoarsely, "Food, please." Aldric's chest tightened. He had barely enough for his family. But he remembered the mercy that had once saved him, the fleeting warmth of sharing when the world offered none. He opened the door and handed the man the last portion of dried roots. The man's eyes glistened, gratitude breaking through despair, and he disappeared into the storm. That night, as Aldric huddled with his family, he felt the bitter truth. Every choice mattered. Every act of mercy, every careful plan, every ounce of courage could mean life or death. The winter had stripped him bare, but it had also revealed the core of his being. A man shaped not by wealth or power, but by endurance, wisdom, and relentless love for his family. Outside, the wind shrieked like a warning. Aldric knew this was only the beginning of the trials to come. The world had not yet surrendered its harshest lessons, and he would be tested beyond anything he had ever imagined. By the time the snow began to thaw, Aldric and his family were gaunt, their hands cracked, their spirits frayed. Months of famine and cold had stripped them not only of strength, but of hope. The forest, once a source of modest sustenance, now seemed endless and indifferent, each tree a silent witness to their struggle. Aldric had grown lean, his face weathered and lined with exhaustion. His sons, though resilient, were pale and quiet, often too tired to play. Lady Alira moved silently, tending to them and the hut with the precision of someone who had long ago abandoned dreams of comfort. Even Aldric's stubborn pride had dulled, replaced by a grim understanding. Survival was now measured not in victories, but in moments of endurance. One morning, he discovered that their water source had dried to a trickle. Panic surged. Without water, food was meaningless. Aldric set out into the forest, following streams and hollows he had once known, searching for even a small spring. Hours passed, the sun scorching, until finally, he found a thin flow beneath a cluster of rocks. Relief surged, but it was bitter. The stream was far from their hut, and the labor of fetching water daily would be brutal. As he returned, he noticed movement at the edge of the forest. A figure crouched among the trees. It was a woman, wild-eyed, shivering, clutching a child. Her voice trembled. "Please, we have nothing, just a crust of bread." Aldric's first instinct was caution. Desperation had made men cruel. Yet, as he watched her face, he felt a pang of recognition. The same fear and hunger that had driven him to this life. He offered her a portion of food and guided them to a safe spot near the edge of his land. The small act, though it cost him precious sustenance, rekindled a spark of purpose. That night, as the family huddled around the fire, Aldric realized how thin the line was between life and death. A single misstep, lost water, illness, raiders could undo everything. The weight of responsibility pressed down harder than any winter storm, and he knew that despair could creep in silently, threatening to consume not only him, but his family. Yet in that same firelight, Aldric glimpsed a stubborn, unyielding truth. Even stripped of everything, even when hope seemed a distant memory, the human spirit could endure. Survival was no longer about power or wealth. It was about courage, cunning, and the willingness to keep going when the world seemed determined to crush you. But as he stared into the dark forest beyond the fire, he sensed something more, something he could not fight with hands or wit alone. Fate, relentless and impartial, had more trials in store, and Aldric felt the creeping dread of knowing that endurance alone might not be enough to protect those he loved. Spring returned, tentative and fragile. The ice thawed, rivers ran clear again, and the first shoots of green emerged from the earth. Aldric, though exhausted and worn, felt a glimmer of possibility in the slow revival of the land. The forest, which had been merciless, now offered small gifts: wild herbs, tender shoots, and the return of small game. With careful hands, he cleared a small patch of fertile soil and planted the seeds he had managed to save. Each day, he tended the growing shoots as if they were treasures, speaking to them softly, believing that nurture could coax life even from scarred earth. Lady Alira joined him, her presence a balm to the family's spirits, and his sons began to help in small, eager ways, learning to survive alongside him. One morning, while scouting the edges of the forest, Aldric found signs of abandoned fields and huts, remnants of families lost to war and famine. Among them, he discovered tools, dried grain, and a half-buried store of potatoes. The find, though meager, was enough to sustain them through the coming weeks. Relief, like a sudden sun after a storm, flooded him. He realized that survival was now as much about observation, knowledge, and patience as it was about raw labor. But the world had not entirely softened. Raiders still lurked, and sickness still claimed the weak. One evening, a traveler collapsed outside their hut, feverish and shaking. Aldric hesitated. Each life he helped meant rations lost, and yet he could not turn the man away. They tended him, shared their meager fire, and nursed him back to a fragile strength. Acts of mercy, once easy under the comforts of wealth, were now sacrifices measured in blood and sweat, but they reaffirmed the humanity that remained in the shadow of devastation. As the days lengthened and warmth returned, Aldric began to see that his family was not only surviving, they were learning, adapting, and growing stronger. His sons, once pale and fragile, now moved with a quiet determination, learning the forest's secrets and how to coax life from the stubborn soil. Lady Alira's strength, though tempered by hardship, shone brighter than ever, guiding them with patience and wisdom. That night, as he watched his children sleep, Aldric felt a rare, fragile joy. He realized that even after losing everything, gold, land, respect, and security, they were forging something more enduring: resilience, knowledge, and the unbroken bond of family. Yet the firelight flickered across the hut's walls, casting long, dancing shadows. Aldric knew the future was uncertain. The world had tested them mercilessly, and it could yet demand more. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself a thought he had long considered impossible. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could endure, and perhaps they could even thrive. Summer returned fully, warmer and more forgiving than any season they had endured in years. Aldric's small patch of land, once barren and cruel, now showed signs of life. Green shoots waved in the wind, promising sustenance, and the forest teemed with birds, rabbits, and herbs that had survived the harsh winter. Aldric's family had grown stronger. His sons, their faces sun-kissed and hands calloused, moved with skill and confidence through the woods. Lady Alira, resilient as ever, had fashioned tools and storage from what little remained, creating a semblance of order and stability. Together, they had begun to rebuild not wealth, but a life forged in hardship. One morning, Aldric ventured farther into the forest, seeking new sources of food. There, among the remains of a burned-out hut, he discovered a hidden cache of supplies: preserved grain, salted meat, and even a few coins. Though small, the find was enough to ease the immediate strain and offered him a rare moment of hope. He returned to the hut with a cautious smile, showing Lady Alira and the boys. Their joy was quiet but genuine, a stark contrast to the laughter of their former life in Highstone. It was simpler, humbler, yet it carried a weight of meaning born from struggle. Aldric felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that the worst of the storm had passed. But life was never simple. The forest held dangers: wild beasts, desperate men, and the lingering threat of disease. One evening, while tending the perimeter of their small homestead, Aldric saw tracks in the mud. Too large for a deer, too deliberate to ignore. Raiders. He gripped his hunting knife, heart pounding, and returned to the hut, preparing for a confrontation he could not avoid. That night, they barricaded the hut as best they could. The raiders came, but Aldric's knowledge of the land gave him the advantage. He led them through traps and pitfalls he had set over months, driving them away with skill rather than force. Exhausted, he returned to his family, chest heaving, and realized something vital. Though he had lost everything once, he had learned to endure in ways his wealth could never have taught him. As he watched the firelight dance across his children's faces, Aldric understood that true strength was not found in gold or titles, but in knowledge, perseverance, and the will to protect what mattered most. They had endured famine, plague, and raiders. They had survived when the world seemed determined to crush them. Yet beyond the walls of their modest hut, the land stretched wide and uncertain, and Aldric knew the future held trials still. But for the first time in years he felt a flicker of confidence, a spark of determination. They could endure, rebuild, and perhaps, someday, thrive. Autumn arrived, this time with a gentler hand. The forest glowed in gold and crimson, and the fields Aldric had nurtured yielded a modest but reliable harvest. Every seed sown, every root dug, every trap set over the past seasons now bore tangible fruit. The family had learned to live with the land, not above it, and it had begun to repay their labor. Aldric's sons were no longer the fragile children he had once held close. They moved with confidence, learned to track game, read the signs of weather, and tend to the growing crops. Lady Alira, her hands scarred and strong, directed them with patience, ensuring the small homestead functioned like a living machine of survival and care. One morning, a traveling merchant appeared at the edge of the forest, weary and cautious. Aldric offered food and water, and in return, the merchant shared news of the wider world. Some villages had begun to rebuild, trade was slowly resuming, and there were whispers of peace in distant lands. It was the first news of hope Aldric had heard in years, a reminder that survival was not only about enduring the present, but also preparing for what could come. Encouraged, Aldric began to expand their modest homestead. He built simple fences, dug storage pits, and planted crops for the future, teaching his sons the skills that would allow them to thrive long after he was gone. Each day was still hard, but it was purposeful. Hunger no longer dictated every decision. Instead, the family worked with intention, building a life that could grow beyond mere survival. Yet Aldric knew that the world could still strike. Plague, famine, raiders, and harsh weather had taught him that security was never guaranteed. Every achievement, every small victory, carried the shadow of uncertainty. But the difference now was his confidence, hard-won. He had endured the worst, and his family had survived with him. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and bathed the forest in amber light, Aldric stood on a ridge, watching his sons chase rabbits through the fields. Lady Alira tended the garden with careful hands, and for the first time, Aldric felt a sense of peace. They were no longer prisoners of circumstance. They were shaping their own destiny, however modestly. He knew the future would hold challenges, yet for the first time he dared to hope. From the ashes of wealth lost, of castles abandoned, of hunger and despair, they had carved a life of resilience, knowledge, and unity. Aldric realized that this life, hard-won, humble, and honest, was worth more than any gold he had ever owned. But even as the wind whispered through the trees, a quiet caution lingered in his heart. The world was never fully tamed, and every new day carried both promise and peril. Winter returned once more, but this time it felt different. Aldric's family was stronger, wiser, and prepared. The hut, though humble, was sturdy. The fields, though small, yielded enough to sustain them, and the lessons of hunger, disease, and loss had forged endurance into their very bones. They were no longer merely surviving, they were living in a way that wealth and power could never have taught. One morning, Aldric stood at the edge of their land, surveying the horizon. Smoke rose from distant villages, but now it brought no panic. Word had come that the plague had receded, the raiders had been driven away, and some semblance of peace was returning to the kingdom. For the first time in years, the future seemed within reach, not a distant, uncertain threat. He watched his sons training with sticks, pretending to wield swords, their laughter carrying across the fields. Lady Alira worked nearby, her hands steady as ever, the lines of hardship softened by the quiet strength she had nurtured in herself and her family. Aldric felt a swell of pride. Not the pride of titles or gold, but the deep, unshakable pride of a man who had endured every torment the world could inflict and had emerged alive, intact, and whole. Aldric knew the trials of the past had changed him. He would never again be the Lord of Highstone in title or wealth, but he had become something greater. a master of resilience, a protector of life, and a man who had learned that true power lay not in commanding others, but in sustaining those you love against all odds. He returned to the hut, kneeling beside the fire as Lady Alira stirred a small pot of stew. The children sat with him, faces flushed with warmth and contentment. Aldric pressed a hand to the earth outside, feeling the soil that had once resisted him, that had challenged him daily, that had demanded sweat, blood, and tears. And he smiled. For the first time, he understood that wealth was not counted in coins or acres, but in the ability to endure, to love, and to rebuild. He had lost everything and yet gained something far more precious: the knowledge that life, however stripped bare, could still flourish. And as night fell over their humble homestead, the wind carried no menace, only the quiet promise of tomorrow. Aldric knew that challenges would always come, that nature and fate were unpredictable and unyielding, but he also knew that he and his family could face them. Together, they had survived the darkest of times, and together, they would continue to endure. The gold, the castles, the titles, all were gone. But in their place stood something eternal, a life forged in hardship, strengthened by love, and tempered by courage. And in that, Aldric had finally found triumph.